Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to a Pocho Hour. I'm your host, Noel El Rancho, OG del Rancho. I don't know. I think I'm just Rancho now. We have a very special guest today, Tokyo Drifter. If you don't know who this gentleman is, he is like, I guess, our historian in residency on the internet, sharing a lot of the history from New Spain, from the Viceroyal era. And personalizing it to us, to Pochos, really. Tokyo, why don't you introduce yourself here?
Hey, how's it going, everybody? Hey, I want to thank all of you for all the work that you all do as well. I've seen a lot of your videos on YouTube. It's very refreshing to see a new community emerge amongst all this conversations that we have with the whole Latin era, the Latinx era that I think has mostly fallen away. It seems like the Latinx political activists have been discredited and they're slowly leaving the scene. But it's just generally speaking, we haven't had fresh discussions about our history in a very, very long time. I know things like Chicano studies have dominated the conversation. Other forms of victimhood narratives have crept onto the scene, and folks haven't been given a different way to view their history. And so I think all the work that you guys have all done, and I hope I've contributed a lot to this new era of historiography for our people, because it's so important. And I think going forward, I think we're going to have a lot more of this. I've seen a lot.
Oh, for sure.
New creators pop up either on TikTok or on YouTube, even on Twitter. There's a lot more being added to this, and I feel like we're very fortunate that people like me and folks like yourselves we were at the beginning of it.
Absolutely.
Beginning of a new era.
Yeah. There is a rising tide in consciousness, I think, with Hispanics in the U.S. And I think there's a lot of things for it. Obviously, 2020 was like a catalyst for a lot. And even, people who are far from these circles, who are just kind of, I think of somebody like Peter Zeihan, or Zeihan, whatever how you say his last name. But he kind of points out how there's a political shift going on in the parties. And one of the traditional demographics that's kind of voted Democrat, being Hispanics and Catholics, are actually coming to the Republican side. And that classic military-industrial complex conservative is going more towards the Democratic side. So, again, that's just to point out that there is many dimensions, many angles to kind of this rising in consciousness, I would say. At least that's how I personalize it for me, because it really has been kind of a process of, sharing and having a conversation with a bunch of other Hispanics who have similar backgrounds to me. But I've seen how it's led to a change in consciousness in people, in being able to discover more of a full picture of who they are and their history, and kind of how that changes the present moment for them. It makes them kind of stand up a little bit different. That's how I would describe it.
Absolutely.
So why don't you share a little bit about your personal background? Like, who you paint the picture for the audience. Who is Tokyo Drifter? Who's the man?
So I would say I'm very much Mexican-American. I grew up in Southern California, very specifically San Diego County. And so I grew up in that context. And so during my childhood, I would go back to Mexico, to Michoacan, and visit relatives. So I never lost touch with that part of my family, even though we were born in the United States, as was my parents. They were both born in the United States as well. So,
so you're second or third generation, I guess.
I would say, yeah, third generation. I mean, it could be even longer than that, because my grandmother was born in Los Angeles in like 1917.
Wow.
Wow. Yeah, and her family had been in the United States, or at least part of her family had been in the United States since it belonged to Spain. It's right. My grandmother's ancestors are listed as among the founders of Los Angeles. The city of Los
way, bro.
Yeah.
Wow. So then you have California ancestry too. It's not just Michoacano.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's amazing.
So I have, that like, deep California roots as well as deep Michoacan roots. But, I grew up mostly with, a consciousnness of being somebody whose family is from Michoacan. We didn't spend much time in like Los Angeles or anything like that. So, I would say my identity is very strongly rooted with my paternal side through my dad. I grew up with the same heroes that a lot of Mexicans grow up with. Emiliano Zapata, who I still think is was a very good man. Emiliano Zapata. If somebody asked me who my favorite post-independence Mexican hero is, it's probably Iturbide and Zapata. I grew up with a lot of the propaganda too. Around Benito Juarez and the War of the Reform I would say I had a very average understanding of Mexican history. I've always found history to be fascinating, so I've always been a little bit of ahead of the game when compared to other people on this stuff. But overall, I was very much an NPC when it came to this stuff.
So would you say that you had more kind of an indigenous centric worldview, right? Like from that absolutely. Mexican nationalistic narrative.
Absolutely. We was Aztecs, the whole shebang, even though, when you're young, it's that stuff. It doesn't make sense now, but it certainly never made sense. Right. But when you're young, you don't really see those.
Well, that's all we ever know. Right. Like that's the history perspective. That's, both imposed on us and shared by us.
Right. And it's imposed. What's fascinating is it's imposed by the Mexican government. And it's also imposed by Chicano studies departments in the United States.
Yeah, and that's what I want to ask you real quick. How much would you say that kind of indigenous-centric view of self or view of history contributed to kind of growing up as a Pocho or a Chicano in SD? Would you call yourself a Chicano, just to be clear?
I wouldn't, only because it has a political connotation, but I wouldn't necessarily say, "Oh, don't call me Chicano" or something like that. But it does. I wouldn't call myself that. I would just call myself Mexican American. That's just
I understand.
But politically neutral.
What happened there, Noel? So
please.
I also don't really go with like the Chicano label, and it's funny, Tokyo, because I'm in the San Diego area now. I moved recently. I'm from New York, so the upbringing is a little bit different. But there's not a big Chicano like culture or presence in New York. That's something more like of a Southern California kind of thing. So I also really just see myself more as like Mexican American, right? Like the general term, right? Because, I'm born here, but, first generation, but also like, my blood is Mexican. My people are Mexican. So, I don't really fill out when they give you like a multiple choices, like Chicano, Mexican American, Mexican. Like I've seen that on the census.
I've seen that too. It's funny.
Yeah, I don't choose Chicano because like really that's like a cultural thing. And so I just wanted to say, since like you grew up in SD, I've been to Chicano Park and I've seen all the murals and everything there. Like how much is that like we was Aztecs like culture?
Oh, so I had to unravel myself from that stuff. Like that was like I got sucked into that stuff for many, many years. And that was probably my first lens into all of this stuff. So
actually, hold on. Since you mentioned that, and I want to do this for the audience real quick, in case you guys aren't familiar with Tokyo Drifter, which I doubt you're not. He has a gigantic TikTok following, and I'm sure your YouTube channel is also large. But you told me earlier you describe your channel as Mexican history through from a Hispano lens, right?
Correct.
Okay, so now go ahead. I just want to, connect that to that.
Yeah. So before I got to that Hispanic lens, I did go through the whole, Chicano studies, Mecha circuit, and some of it, I could see the intention when these ideas were developing in the 60s and 70s. And, the 60s and 70s was a much more difficult time for Mexican Americans in the United States. So I could see the good intention that this was built upon. But ultimately it's sort of, which is really, the most fascinating thing, or one of the most fascinating things about this is the Chicano studies, we was Aztec narrative. It's kind of like an extension of the Mexican government's narrative. And if you ever find yourself simply repeating the government's narrative, you're not really a rebel. You are just an extension. Yeah. So, and I see a lot of people do this, and I think, a lot of people think that this whole "we was Aztec" thing is just like it's almost like a mark of rebellion. When in reality, it's like you're just repeating the government's narrative.
And that government is a product of a certain class and culture of people who, more than likely, those people rabidly defending it don't belong to. What's more, it's also like, I always found kind of an irony in it, because it's, here you are trying to defend the indigenous root, which we have, which I think we definitely should, and we seek to honor it and know more about it. I think it's amazing. I'm grateful to God for every drop of blood I have, right? From every single ancestor in that tree, of course. Otherwise I wouldn't exist, obviously. But I think it's, we take this supposed perspective of kind of, we are the Indians. We're not the Spaniards who conquered. We're the Indians who got conquered. Technically we kind of come from both. And sometimes, sometimes Indians also conquered, and Spanish also got conquered.
And no, it's worse than that. It's like, we're not just our conquering forefathers. We're not them. We're the Indians that they defeated.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Like, could you imagine a more insulting thing? So many people do. It's like, you're the descendant of the conquerors, and you're the descendant of their allies, and you've appropriated the identities of their victims,
of the vanquished.
It's just such a sick ideology. It really is.
But more than that, I think it's so hypocritical, because you're saying, let's honor the indigenous. Let's not erase the indigenous. Let's not let the Spanish erase the indigenous, right? Let's not let it overshadow. But you're not even Aztec. Who are the actual Indians you actually come from? Wouldn't it be interesting to know? Like, how are you honoring your ancestors' heritage by taking on natives who were actually enemies of your actual indigenous ancestors? Like, it's
Exactly. So I would go to Michoacan, and I would, like, there are natives that still live there, right? It's not like in Michoacan, being native is not a thing of the past. It's not some distant Cherokee grandma thing. It's you go to the markets there in Uruapan or Morelia, you'll see indigenous people everywhere. Like, they're there. They're a fixture.
I know Purépechas from Michoacan. I know actual Purépechas from Purépecha villages in Michoacan.
Absolutely. And so for so there was always that I was always aware of, right? And then but then I was also always aware of, well, I'm Mexican, so but I'm Aztec, and but there's also these other people that live in Michoacan where my grandpa lives, and so that was always kind of just buzzing in the background, right? Then and so I knew that I shared some sort of like maybe connection with Purépecha people, just because they were so close in proximity to where my family's from.
Right.
And then also, I but I also had this, this Aztec thing going on. And then, and then my grandpa used to talk about, when we'd go down there, my grandpa would talk about the fact that his family owned, ranches in Michoacan, and they own ranches like right near Zamora. And I thought, like, that's interesting. And then he would talk about like, we had these ranches, and these rebels came and took away the land. And I always thought, like, well, when did that happen? He's like, well, right around the time of the revolution. And so remember, I had gone through the whole Chicano studies kind of historiography thing. So I thought, like, well, that's interesting. My family were revolutionaries, but they also had land, and they were fighting rebels. Nothing made sense, right? Like, nothing made sense. And because you couldn't possibly be a descendant of the quote unquote bad guys, right? And so, so my grandpa would often talk about that stuff, and I didn't, my grandpa, when he came to the United States in the like 1940s early 1950s, he came as a bracero farm worker. So he didn't come as like this like wealthy criollo.
He didn't come on horseback.
No, nothing like that. Nothing like that. So he was a a very honest man, a very humble man, and a hardworking man. And he was, as hardworking as any other campesino that's out there,
Yeah.
And so, he was a very strong man, but he wasn't a wealthy man. And so the stories he would say about that stuff, it was kind of like, that's fascinating, Grandpa. But there's really no way to like corroborate that stuff, right?
Right.
And then, so as sort of time passed, and I, went through high school. In high school, I kind of fell away from like caring about history and stuff like that. I went through the whole like, the whole Chicano gangster sort of scene.
Yeah.
And, got pulled away by those influences. And then eventually
it's a rite of passage for the Pocho.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, are you really a
the Pocho bar mitzvah is getting jumped?
So I went through that whole sort of like, Chicano scene in growing up in San Diego. And then eventually I had a chance to go to college, and we could talk about that a little later, but I had a chance to go to college, and, and I was into, I started like finding my interest in history again, and a Mexican history, and and I kind of extended into other things like Asian history.
Where did you go to college, by the way?
So I went to San Diego State for my bachelor's, and I
go
went to
Aztecs.
and I went to UC Berkeley for my master's.
Right, and you have a master's in international relations, which I think is very important because, again, international relations gives you like history, geopolitics, economics. It gives you all these things to kind of all these lenses, right? In the theme of that, to look at history and the present moment. So that's great. Okay, please keep going.
Yeah, and so just kind of going through all that stuff, I started rekindling my flame for history and identity, and then also I kind of came back to these stories that my grandpa used to tell me when I was younger, and about
the ranches.
So I started, exactly, about the ranches and stuff like that. And I started looking into that stuff. And now that I was older and I knew how to do research professionally, and I use these skills that I, learned through my education to apply them to my family history. And it was very fascinating what I found, very eye-opening. And so I've been able to trace my family back to like the 1500s. And I but
you started.
What I found in that research was nothing like what the Mexican government promoted as a national narrative, and it was nothing like what Chicano studies departments promote in their narratives. So by studying my own family history, I removed the politics from it, and I just looked at it very. I was finding my own identity. I wasn't trying to like uphold some national narrative. I wasn't trying to, defend a political position. I was just trying to find out more about who my grandfather was. And
so that was the first domino. So you started with your grandpa's ranches around the time of the Revolution, which is like what, 1910?
Right. So the Revolution was from 1910 to around 1920. But there were some major land reforms that happened in the 1930s, so that the revolution sort of spilt over into the 1930s.
Right. Okay. So early 1900s up into the 1930s, and so that was the first domino. And by the time they all fell down, you were in 1492. Right.
So
let me jump in. Those 1930s land reforms also translated into the Cristero War, because the agraristas who were getting this land. They were told that you needed to fight the Cristeros, which were the enemy of the government giving them the land. And so the only way they could get the land was if they took up arms against their countrymen.
And what was your family's history in this conflict?
So you have this period where in the 1910s to like 1920, Michoacan saw sporadic fighting. Some of the worst fighting of the revolution happened in other places, but there was sporadic fighting and chaos, limited government because basically local governments were cut off from any help from the central government to deal with rebellions and looting. And it's funny if you actually talk, and this isn't to disparage necessarily the revolution entirely, because I think the revolution did have some valid concerns.
Sure.
But we also have to, if you talk to older people from that time or who lived in that or whose parents lived in that time, you'll find out that a lot of what we think of as revolutionaries were just looters. And so it was a very difficult time for everybody. And so in the 1920s, that's when the Cristero War started taking effect, because the Mexican government essentially became it's more or less a communist government. The Mexican government has always seen the Catholic Church as competition, because Mexico has gone through countless civil wars, and the Mexican government never really had credibility with its own people. If you talk to average Mexicans now, they'll tell you not to trust the government and stuff like that. So the Mexican government's never really had
right.
As much as nationalistic as Mexicans are for the land and for their culture, the governments themselves have always been viewed skeptically.
Right.
And so at least in the very early period of Mexican independence, the only institution that had any credibility with the people was the church. And it was the only source of stability that cut across all these other civil wars that were going on in politics. And so the Mexican government has always, no matter which regime or rebel group or warlord or corrupt leader has taken over the government, they've always seen the Catholic Church as competition. And so that really peaked in the 1920s, and the Mexican government.
This is the Cristero War, right?
Yeah, this happened under Calles during the Cristero War. So.
Yeah. Sorry, Tokyo, but it also continued on
into the 1930s.
Right, clandestinely. Various groups were met with reprisals, different generals.
Right. I'll address that in a second.
Yeah.
So you have multiple things happening at one time. Okay, you have the government the government had seized church properties, and there's lots of there's a lot of criticism that I have for that whole era. Well, obviously, right, because I'm Catholic, but the way the government did it, when the government talks about seizing church property, they make it sound like it's like this land that's controlled by the Vatican or something like that. The church property was mostly in the cities. It was mostly in urban centers. It wasn't like out in these like sprawling, vast prairies in Mexico or something like that. It was mostly like, stuff in urban centers. Okay. And so the government seized those properties as well. And so if you go to like a classical church in Mexico, they're still owned by the government. And the government had, remember, we're talking about a country where the government has no credibility with its own people, and people that don't believe in their government also don't pay taxes. And so the government has always used churches as a vehicle to extract money from the population. So, people, Catholics go and, they'll pay their tithes or something as the community should. But, you at various points in Mexican history, you've had the Mexican government dipping into the church coffers and funneling it off to the government. And so this had gone on for a very long time, and it just got so bad where in the 1920s, the Mexican government just shut the doors of the churches altogether. And so, there was a time where people couldn't even.
And this is when you said that the government form was very kind of communistic
The government has never said we are communists, only because out of fear of the United States. So the government never used those terms. They might dip into the socialist realm and call themselves socialists or something like that. But the government was very, very influenced by the Soviet
Marxism.
Union.
Yeah. And
Marxism.
Let's real quick for the audience to again kind of contextualize. This is like the 20s and 30s Mexico.
Yeah.
You had Trotsky in Mexico. Remember, he was murdered in Mexico. He was in Mexico for a reason.
Yeah.
And then it's also important to note that I believe, and I got this from a Mexican friend of mine from Mexico, that I believe that this government hosted like the first or second Communist International meeting, like that, the big communist meeting when all the
exactly.
The Met Gala of Marxism was in Mexico. Mexico was a participant in that.
Right. And so the Mexican government never officially called itself communist, but you just look at their actions rather than what they say, right? I mean, because as you should with Hispanics. The United States, they can't just pick up and move away from the United States, so they have to tread a fine line. And so as this was happening on like the church side, the Mexican government was funding peasant movements, campesino movements, and these campesinos were called militant campesinos were called agraristas. And this was happening in the 20s and 30s, and this is what I believe Taco, this is what you were referring to. So the government was funding these agraristas, and they were more or less like left-wing radicals. And so the government used them as a militant arm, basically the militant arm of the government, right. And like almost like basically a paramilitary arm. And so these folks were used to go and run landowners off their properties and stuff like that. And so this went on all throughout the 20s and 30s, even after the Cristero War had ended officially. And so the agraristas, it was less about religion, and it was more about clearing these ranches so that they could be expropriated by the government. And so the government went in and expropriated the land, and then they would allow the campesinos to apply for portions of it. So, for example, if on a certain ranch or hacienda, 20 or 30 people lived there, or 20 or 30 heads of households lived there, they could petition the government. And then once they petitioned the government would come in, it'd survey the land and see how much land was actually there, how much was arable, how much was wooded land, how much irrigation there was. And they had, a certain formula to divide up the land into plots. And so now if you're thinking, well, what's wrong with that? The hacienda owners had controlled too much. I think there is some, there's a very, that's a valid argument to make. I think that the hacienda owners and the ranchers, they were more powerful than they should have been. And they were more powerful than they were during the colonial period. And this is where we do when we march backward in time to find out how we got there, I'll cover this. But these ranchers and hacienda owners, they were actually much more powerful after independence than they were during the colonial period.
So no, and that's important to dive into. Guillermo, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, I wanted to, just so he could explain to the audience a little bit regarding sides that were taken in the Cristero Wars, maybe for people that aren't well versed in this part of Mexican history. So if you look at the Wikipedia page for the Cristero Wars, you'll see in belligerents, like the two main sides that are fighting. And on the left side here, it says the Mexican government, which includes the Mexican Army, the United States, and the Ku Klux Klan. And then it says they're going up against the Cristeros, the Vatican, Ireland, and the Knights of Columbus.
Yeah, exactly.
I was wondering if maybe for people that'd be puzzled by why the Ku Klux Klan is fighting against the Cristeros, if you could explain that for people that are listening.
Yeah. So the United States in every single conflict in Mexican history, the United States has tipped the scales in the side of on one side or the other. So basically, the United States has picked a winner in every conflict, and one aspect that the United States was trying to or one strategy that the United States had in dismantling Mexican institutional power was, the United States also had to find allies in all of this, right? And so one of those allies was Protestantism. So the United States, very early on, once it installed Juarez in power, the United States also had Mexico implement, freedom of religion, because in the earliest part of Mexican independent history, you had to be Catholic in order to be a citizen. So one important thing to do if you're going to take over Mexican politics is you have to dismantle the power of the church. And so the United States, because of that, had always funded Protestant missionaries. And you see this is not just Mexico, this is all of Latin America. All of the missionaries, the Protestant missionaries that you see in like Central America, Mexico, South America, those aren't people coming from Jerusalem preaching the gospel. Those are people who are funded by various powers in the United States.
Oh yeah. I was going to say there's a university right by me, a Christian one, where they have like a little statue memorial for the founders, because those founders, they're like Anglo-Americans and they went to Central America to go preach that, but they ended up getting eaten alive by the locals.
Wow. Yeah, it's like playing ball in the wrong court, buddy. Yeah.
Oh no, what do they say? Play stupid games, win stupid prizes, bro, America.
Yeah, we were just winning prizes left and right. So the Ku Klux Klan is supporting the Mexican government and all of that.
Yeah, what are they hoping to get out of
Wait,
this?
the Ku Klux Klan is supporting basically the Mexican communists to own the church.
Right.
Correct.
What are they hoping? Like, are they aware that these are communists? And like, what do they?
The Mexican Masons are involved, and I think that's another very important component to this, right?
Right. And so, so you have to remember, like even the KKK at various times has been a psyop, right? So, the United States had its own paramilitary wing, if you will. Huh. So the KKK supporting the Mexican government and all of this was just like an attack on Catholicism. It was an attack on the traditional institutions of the country, and it was just a part of that. Basically, that's how they fit into all of this. And so when this is happening, like going back to what I was saying, you would think like, okay, well, what about didn't they like the campesinos, didn't they have a valid argument that they should have had access to their own land? I think there is some validity in that argument. The issue is here. One, why were indigenous people supporting the Cristeros in all of this? If this was about if the agraristas wanted land and the Cristeros were, they were fighting a religious struggle. Indigenous people, even some Zapatistas, joined the Cristero struggle right after the revolution. And the reason why is because the program that the Mexican government after the revolution, the program that was implemented, it was not a recognition of indigenous land rights. What Zapata was actually fighting for was recognition of indigenous land titles. It's very important. And this is always left out of these discussions when you talk to Mexican leftists about this stuff.
Who loves Zapata?
The Mexican government, in all of these attacks on the church or the attacks on the landowners, none of this included going back and recognizing indigenous land. So what this amounted to was the Mexican government basically rewarding its militant allies with, with ejido plots. It wasn't about going back and like, oh, let's give these Mayans back. Let's go recognize their land titles. It wasn't nothing like that.
Right. So again, let me just kind of summarize that for the audience here, because some of my audience is a little slow. Let's just be honest with you guys. But the main point here again is that Zapata, the great idol revolutionary and a noble man, I think it's uncontested. But especially he's kind of an idol of the left. His legal argument for his uprising is we want the land grants that the Spanish king made with us. Correct. A couple hundred years before you guys were born.
Correct. So Zapata had organized his rebellion and he began militantly organizing in 1909. Began, securing weapons for his cause, and this was after years of frustration with the local government. His community, his indigenous community, had a land title that was issued by the King of Spain in 1607. And so when he was, arguing with the Mexican government, he wasn't just saying like, "Hey, I'm Aztec, give me land." It was nothing like that. It was nothing like what
land back.
Yeah, I'm Aztec. Give me land back. It was not that. Okay, like that. Like this is where we have to discredit political activists wherever they are and wherever they push this Aztec stuff. He was very specifically asking the Mexican government to recognize his land grant that was issued by the King of Spain, and the Mexican government denied him that. And the reason why Mexican leftists and progressives are so invested in denying the fact that natives even had land, that natives even had titles, right? Because if you listen to the average Mexican political activist, you would think natives didn't have land at all. You would think that they had no land, right? That they were all just servants.
Everybody just shared.
Not just that. You would think that in the 300 years of the colonial period, that these people were just living on ranches and that they had no land at all. When in reality, 90% of indigenous people had land during the colonial period. In 1810, the year Mexico became independent, 90% of indigenous people lived on communal lands that were secured with land titles from the King of Spain.
And some of these land titles you couldn't even sell. That means even if the Indians wanted to sell it, they couldn't. It was Correct. Perpetual for the rest of time. This is your land. And so when you discovered this, when you're going through, you're knocking the dominoes down, you're going down the rabbit hole, and then boom, you hit up this brick wall of, wait, I thought this leftist indigenous man was freeing us from the Spanish yoke, but his legal argument is, hey, honor your contract that I made with, the Spanish king.
Correct.
And that leads you to learn, wait a minute, Indians had a lot more land all over the map, and they started actually losing their land, their legal holdings of land when the Republic was born.
Right. Now, it's actually worse than that. It's actually worse than that. Because in the colonial period, the Spanish king and through his viceroy issued two types of land grants. That's most important here. They issued land titles, which were recognition of indigenous land rights. Right. So some native people were not. They simply continued to live exactly where they lived in pre-colonial times. They just, they lived in their little population clusters. And then once they formed a peace treaty with the colonial government would say, here is a land title. And this is, in Spanish, it's the títulos that you might hear about or you read about when you're learning about this stuff. These land titles were recognition of land that they already owned. So it was kind of like, you've accepted to be part of the Spanish Empire. We will accept the fact that you own this piece of land. And here's a title saying that that we recognize it. Okay. So a title was just giving you a piece of paper so that way you had legally recognized land that could be defended in Spanish courts. Okay, and many of these titles were based on pre-colonial land claims. So, a progressive, a Mexican activist might say something like, well, these land titles, they were just issued by the King of Spain. That's an agreement. That was an agreement with the previous government or something like that. It's not an agreement with the Mexican Republic. Well, many of these titles, perhaps most of them, were based on pre-colonial land claims. So once an indigenous community had a peaceful relationship with the Spaniards, they could bring in evidence. They even used like pre-colonial writings, and they would go into their local court, and they'd be like, "Hey, this is our land. We have a peace treaty with the colonial government. We have a peace treaty with the King of Spain. This is our land here, and we just want a title recognizing that." And so the government would recognize these land titles. So if you go and actually look up these land titles in Mexican archives, because these things still exist, you can go to these and find these files where there are titles that are written and like notarized by a Spanish notary, and they are accompanied by pages and pages of maps. Many of them are written in indigenous languages. Now, a lot of them were written in indigenous languages in the colonial period, but they were written in indigenous languages by like the first generation of people that lived in the Spanish Empire, and were presenting their evidence and their land claims. So you can go into these archives and find títulos along with maps, etc., showing that these land claims were pre-colonial claims.
And wait, that's really profound. Let's really unpack that, because there's a lot in that needs to be understood. So prior to this happening, these indigenous groups or populations or city states, at various levels of development, didn't have the jurisprudence, right? They didn't have a legal system. They didn't have maps. They didn't necessarily even have their language written in written form yet. So in order for an indigenous group to have a land grant under the King of Spain, there's a couple things that are packed into that, right? That means that a missionary had to learn the language, transcribe it into the Latin alphabet, and then teach them how to use it. And then legal rights are being recognized. And I think that's really, really important. That's a detail that a lot of us look over. And I think it ties into kind of this warped historical view that's wrong that we have, that we kind of treat, we as Americans going through American history, public school, or public schooling around American history, we presume that the way that the Anglos treated the Negroes is the way that the Spaniards treated the Indians.
It's just not the same history. And like, you cannot compare the two. It's just simply not the same history. It's a completely different history.
Right. We presume that basically Indios were essentially slaves like the American Negroes were. And that's just completely a lie. So you crash around this new truth that you can't reconcile with the Mexican nationalist narrative, with this kind of Chicano offshoot of that narrative.
Right.
You can't reconcile this truth. And so where does that lead you?
So it leads me to look at another aspect. So how does my family fit into this? So my grandfather was born on a ranch in Michoacan that was owned by his grandfather. And so now I learn about how land rights functioned. My family still had land, right? And this is in 1910, 1920, a lot of people were landless in Mexico. Like the overwhelming majority of people were landless. Like 80% of all arable land was owned by around 900 families in a country of 10 million people.
Right. Wow.
And so, but my family had land. And so one is how did they come into possession of this land? How did they lose this land? Because my family did have that taken away from them.
They had more land.
Right. And then, how did natives lose their land? And And then one thing to put on the table here is, okay, after Mexico became independent, these títulos in various stages were invalidated. Okay, these communal lands. Okay, and you might think, okay, well, those are, the King of Spain's titles or whatever. So this is an easy way to debunk that argument. The king also issued titles to individuals, to Spanish men, right? And so if you were a founder of a new town, if you were a conquistador, you didn't have to be a conquistador to get paid in land, although they were. You could just be a poblador. A poblador was somebody who was a first settler, and this was very important in colonial times to be a poblador, because the pobladores, they were the ones who were basically the local aristocrats of the town. And so these pobladores were given land titles that they could, sell. You could sell it. You could, buy. You could buy land grants. You could buy. You could, bequeath them to your children, etc. And this created the local landed aristocracy that lasted in Mexico. And the thing is, after independence, Mexico simply rolled over those land grants and recognized them in the new government. So anybody who was a landowner prior to Mexican independence was also a landowner after independence. The only people who lost their land were indigenous people. And so this we're already starting to debunk big pieces of Mexican propaganda, Mexican government propaganda.
And let's not be, I don't want the audience to misconstrue what we're saying, that when we're saying Mexico here, this is true for all the other republics of Latin America, right? Like Chile, Argentina, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Cuba, they're all the same. This is not this is not something that was only true within the Mexican government. All the governments of that inherited what was once the Spanish Empire followed this exact same pattern.
Yeah, if you're from a Latin American country, with the exception of Venezuela or Cuba, and those are not good governments either, so this is not a defense of them. But if you're from any standard republic in Latin America, your government was created by with the help of the United States and the British. This happened. All of these things happened all over the continent. So
so that has to be reconciled. That has to be reconciled because again, we also have this we associate the United States with Spain, right? Before the United States was our rival, it was Spain who was our rival.
Right.
And so it's important to know that the Anglos, whether they're on the east side of the Atlantic or the west side of the Atlantic, they played a role in these quote unquote independence movements, which were pretty much aristocratic criollo land grabs of indigenous land. Correct? Correct.
So the wealthiest people, so in colonial Mexico, and this is basically true for any other viceroyalty in the Americas, there were two types of elites. There were the criollos and the peninsulares. Well, the peninsulares were really just limited to Mexico City. They were more or less like the technocrats in the capital. The criollos were also aristocrats. They were also the elites of, not all criollos, right? Because most people were poor, right? Most people were farmers or something like that. So we're not talking of criollo as a ethnic racial term. We're talking about as a socioeconomic class. We're talking the oligarchy. Well, okay. So it's basically like this. Not all criollos were elites, but all the elites were criollos, or some mixed race people, but who had married into who were descended from aristocrats. And so So the Mexican War of Independence, and this is basically true all over Latin America, it was a struggle between the criollo aristocrats, who were the landed aristocracy, against the peninsulares, who were in their capital, the people who were actually from Spain.
Against the crown.
Yeah, exactly. Now, Mexico is a very interesting case. It doesn't track the same way that the story of Simón Bolívar does, because Bolívar, he was a Masonic Republican for basically the entire time. Pretty much the entire time.
He joined the club officially.
Yeah. And because he was influenced by Francisco Miranda was also a Freemason. Mexico's independence war was actually won by the conservative side. This is what makes Mexico's independence a lot different than other Latin American independence movements. So the commander of the Mexican Independence Army in 1820 and 1821 was Agustín de Iturbide. He was a criollo, and but he wasn't part of the earlier like Freemason independence struggle. He was
not a liberal.
Right, he wasn't a liberal. He was a man of law and order.
He was originally a loyalist, wasn't he?
Right, he was much so. He was one of the captains in the colonial army, but he was instrumental in getting the colonial army to essentially switch sides. So when we think about like the Mexican army entering Mexico City in 1821, entering triumphantly to cheers and stuff, the people were actually the overwhelming majority of the Mexican Independence Army were actually former colonial soldiers that had switched sides.
Right, and Iturbide was crucial at this, and this is for those looking for checkpoints in history. This is the dawn of the Mexican Empire, the short-lived Mexican Empire.
Right.
It's very important to know this history, even if you're not from Mexico, from the rest of Latin America, because it shows more of the different angles or different sides that really played a role throughout the independence movements. It kind of just gives it a more refined dimension. You're able to understand it or see it a much more refined, because the political turmoil in the Americas is reflecting the political turmoil that Spain is going in the Iberian Peninsula at the dawn of Napoleon. So you basically have these factions kind of spring up, like Simón Bolívar is emblematic of this kind of liberal Masonic bringing into liberal Enlightenment values into Latin America. But you also had this kind of conservatives that were like, we still would like a king and kind of keep the status quo. But I kind of do see that there's some turmoil in Spain, so we got to do something on our own here, because obviously it's not working out in Iberia since Napoleon's there.
Well, not just that. So there was that front end aspect from 1810 to really 1808, when Napoleon's brother became king. So from 1810, when the war really kicked off, to 1814 or 15, you do have lots of chaos. There is no king to hold the empire together. You have various factions coming up with new ideas to govern. And then you also have Peninsulares, who claim that they're the true Spanish government, when in reality, there was no king. And so according to Spanish laws at the time, and this is where, some of these early independence movements, I'll speak about the case of Mexico. In the absence of the king and in the absence of a legitimate monarchy, sovereignty is supposed to be devolved back to the local level until a legitimate monarchy is reestablished. So in 1808, the viceroy of Mexico, he actually had positive relations with the city council of Mexico City. And so when the city council of Mexico City got word that Spain had been conquered and there was no monarchy, according to Spanish laws, what should have happened was the highest ranking authority in New Spain, the viceroy, he would have been the highest authority. Like the audiencias the court system in Mexico, they would have answered to him rather than to people in Spain. So there was a legitimate claim to autonomy that the criollos had, according to Spanish laws. And so
the criollos are peninsulares.
The criollos had a legitimate claim to autonomy, not to complete independence, but according to Spanish laws, the criollos did have a legitimate claim to autonomy because
through the viceroy.
In the absence of the king, the highest authority would be the viceroy. But each viceroyalty had its own viceroy. So there would have been, think of it like a confederation rather than a full-on monarchy, right? Mm-hmm. And then once the king were to be reestablished, then the system would go back to the way it was. Well, so the criollos and the viceroy were discussing how this would play out. And so while this was all happening, some peninsulares who disagreed with that position, and the peninsulares who were in alliance with a military council that was established in Sevilla, and it later moved to Cádiz, but it was originally established in Sevilla. There was a military council that claimed to be the representative of the king. And so some peninsular, like basically the business class, like the international business class, the merchants, they organized a rebellion to arrest the viceroy. And they actually went into the palace and arrested the viceroy. And so this created like the seditious planning that went on among the criollos beginning in 1808, and it popped off in 1810 when they began their rebellion against the Mexico City government, because the Mexico City government was propped up by the merchant class. And the merchant class, I mean, it was a military coup. That's what it was. So it was.
So the merchants. Now, these merchants enjoy bagels, or were they just merchants?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe, I'm not sure. Well, you know what it is. I'll tell you one thing. These merchants, they were in cahoots with Sevilla, and who propped up the military government in Sevilla? It was the British.
Interesting.
So,
okay, so now we see how the British are kind of playing more than one side here.
Right, exactly. The British played multiple sides in this. Okay, multiple sides
every single time.
Yeah. The entire resistance in this is the sort of unfortunate part of like how all this just fell apart. The resistance against Napoleon in Spain was propped up by the British.
Right. So
the British were stacking the deck in Spain.
Yeah.
And so this is how we end up with the Constitution of Cádiz, and because
and these were the liberal reforms, the Court of Cádiz.
Correct. So that came about in 1812. So from 1810 to 1812, we have like these epic wars going on throughout the Americas. There's no legitimate king. There's no legitimate way to move forward. No one's following the laws that they should be following, because in a perfect scenario, the viceroy would have just taken charge, and then we wouldn't have the society wouldn't have collapsed into chaos. And so, but the viceroy was arrested, and it's very likely that the viceroy was arrested, at the direction of the British. But it was certainly by people who were aligned with Sevilla, and Sevilla was propped up by the British. And so, so we have this going on, and then this is how we get to, the Constitution of Cádiz as a way to resolve, all these conflicts that were going on. Really, it was these intellectuals that were promoting the Constitution of Cádiz, and they had diplomats. They had delegates from various parts of the empire. So it wasn't just like people in Spain who had no connection with like the local people in Mexico and Latin America. Like there were delegates from all over. So it was one way to resolve the situation.
There was some level of legitimacy to it.
They were trying to promote legitimacy.
Oh, okay.
May I just say something, at least in the context of Latin America, regarding like Colombia, Venezuela, these areas? I can say for certain that a lot of these reforms were, like, how would I put it? I would say that these reforms they included a lot of things that were necessary that if Spain addressed like 100 years earlier, it would have been a lot better. And I'll give some examples. Like, for example, these reforms for the first time allowed mestizos, blacks, Indians to advance to a level in the military that they previously couldn't if they weren't like considered to be Spanish, because the Spanish Empire did take on a little bit more of a it wasn't like the French or the British in terms of like being super autistic racially, but they started to create a lot more limitations for what Indians and blacks and mestizos could officially do if they weren't considered Spanish on paper. So like being able to become priests, being able to rise up in the military past a certain rank, a lot of these sorts of things where you technically had to be Spanish on paper. These reforms finally allowed these people, without having to change what they were considered racially, it finally took place. So I think at the same time, it's easy to, I don't know, dismiss all of this as like liberal reforms, but at the same time, if it weren't for like these reforms, a lot of groups were just going to stay disenfranchised, and this disenfranchisement was something that the criollos were able to capitalize,
right,
in order to galvanize mestizos and indigenous people to fight on their side, and I think that needs to be addressed.
Yeah. So yes, this is sort of one of the downsides of having lots of your laws created like across the ocean that is like detached from what's
reality.
happening. Right, exactly. So in the earlier part of the colonial period, the sort of the mixed race question wasn't front and center, and mestizos weren't the main character in all of this. And so
because they were a small portion of the population, people hadn't quite gotten to the mixing part yet.
A small portion of the population, but you have to remember, like Nueva España and basically all of these viceroyalties, they were in like a permanent state of war, and so if you were living in Guadalajara and you were a young man and you wanted to make a name for yourself, in the same way your ancestors left Granada to go to the Americas, you would have left Guadalajara to go to what became Sinaloa or Sonora or even Los Angeles, where my ancestors went to on my grandmother's side. So there were more adventures for you to fight. And then if you managed to establish a new town,
yes,
if you managed to establish your own town, you became part of a new aristocracy. And so
you got to join the club.
Exactly.
That sounds like a repeated tactic from the Reconquista in a lot of ways.
It was.
That's exactly what it was.
Let's give some context to the audience real quick. So during the Reconquista, when the Muslims had a big chunk of Iberia, the Christian kingdoms would basically say, hey, if you help us take out the Muslim warlord on the other side of the river, you can take a bit of his land, found a city, and have the rights and privileges that we get to have here.
Correct. And so this is how Spain, the entire story of the Reconquista is a story of a moving frontier. And so every, few couple of kilometers you move forward, you build a new town, and then you create new leaders and new aristocracy, and your descendants, for your heroic deeds, your descendants would be recognized in perpetuity, at least at the local level. And this worked for a very, very long time in the Hispanic world. If you think about our history as a history of our paternal lineages, it's our Hispanic forefathers, moving down the Iberian Peninsula and then finally conquering Granada and then sailing across the ocean and like recreating life in the Americas, recreating Spanish life on the frontier in the Americas. So when my ancestors settled in Michoacan in like the late 1500s, early 1600s, the frontier was Zamora. Like that was the frontier. On the other side of the Lerma River was no man's land. It was the Chichimecas. It was chaos. It was, paganism, etc. And so, my ancestors, when they settled in the context of war. And so, so other people moved that frontier further northward. And then that's eventually where we get to Texas and California, et cetera. And every time they moved this frontier forward, they would build new towns. So like Aguascalientes, for example, was entirely established as a beachhead against the Chichimecas. But the same is true for all of these towns in northern Mexico. This is another big difference between southern Mexican history and northern Mexican history.
Right.
We always think of like how Tenochtitlan was conquered, right? And like Cortez built Mexico City above it, right? On the ruins of the rest. Well, that's not the story of northern Mexico. Is much different. The story there were no those were like nomadic lands, and the time that they had been conquering through there, that was like frontier land. There were certainly natives there. They were like more nomadic or whatever. So all of the towns of northern Mexico are like frontier towns. And so all of this system lasted, and it prevented, in a way, by externalizing frustration or maybe even economic stagnation, by externalizing internal frustration. The Spanish Empire was able to expand. People were able to create new towns, and internal civil wars were constantly averted for 300 years. And then boom, we have this reversal in 1810 where the empires just started turning in on itself.
I want to say even around this time as well, I think more direct evidence that I guess the crown in Europe just wasn't paying quite as much attention as they should have in the Americas is evidenced in the fact of things like the Louisiana Purchase, where they sold all of this land to the United States, the Bourbons, I believe, or no, it was the Napoleon that did it.
It was the French.
Biggest fumble in Hispanic history was giving up Louisiana.
When you have like French leaders selling all of that shit that was, basically Hispano and partly French frontiersmen, just selling it to the Americans, I get why a lot of these independence movements started to resonate with the locals there, because it's like they were completely out of touch. And I think
it was not just that. So imagine for a second, like these new frontier towns propping up, and then, more adventures for your descendants to go on whenever they wanted to, become a landed aristocrat. Well, with the Bourbon reforms, the Bourbon reforms, in some ways, they were kind of like holding these criollos accountable for their BS too, right? So there were some heavy-handedness that came down. It was also a way to like extract more taxes from the local population. But unfortunately, what this also did was it created new layers of oversight and new bureaucrats from like the Spanish Peninsula. And this is what this is one of the main factors that created this incredible resentment between local criollos and people from the peninsula. See, when we think of like, the conquistadors conquering all this place, like, well, a lot of the conquistadors were actually criollos. Like in the 300 stretch of history, the 300-year stretch of history, the overwhelming majority of all these conquests, all these expeditions were done by criollos, mestizos, and indigenous people. But like, for example, I always bring this up as an example, is Juan de Oñate. He's held up as like the Spanish conquistador or whatever, but he was born in Zacatecas.
Right.
So for a big stretch of history,
he was a homie.
Yeah, the empire to some degree was on autopilot. Like the viceroy in Mexico City, the viceroy in Mexico City would approve conquests, and then local criollos and mestizos would go out and do these conquests. For example, like even the conquest of the Philippines, that was not that wasn't just the Spanish king that just pushed a button and made it happen. Like it was actually the viceroy and then later the audiencia that approved the expedition to go to the Philippines to conquer.
And indigenous conquistadors existed, and they played a huge role in that. I mean, the Southwest, a big chunk of northern Mexico, was conquered by Tlaxcaltecas, who were the enemies of the Aztecs.
Right, and so we're having this kind of unfold where the empires, and I don't want to say autopilot because like there was still a lot of like, the monarchy was still directing a lot of this, but like a lot of this stuff was happening where a Nueva España itself was expanding, and without just simply having Peninsulares just, come in and step on everybody's throats, it was really Criollo conquistadors and expeditionary leaders moving the frontier forward. And then with the Bourbon reforms, it sort of reset everything. And it's hard to come in and tell a Criollo aristocrat, like, oh, you can't do that anymore, or I'm the guy in charge now. I mean, I could just imagine a Criollo from a very prestigious family whose ancestors conquered the frontiers. And then all of a sudden, some 31-year-old Peninsular comes in and says, I'm the guy in charge now.
Tío, with a lisp. He came with a lisp, and he said, Tío, vosotros esta tierra no es suya.
Came in here with his flashy degrees and,
and his green eyes.
Yeah, he's never fought a war in his life. Like, this is the thing. Like, a lot of, like...
it's so human, we laugh because... It's just so fucking human, and I try to bring people back to that. It's like you got to stop judging people from the past as if they're any different from the pieces of crap we are.
Well, I mean, just think like Spain hasn't had a frontier since 1492. There was like the frontier life ended in Spain, right? And it's like there were Mexicans fighting Apaches like up until like 1905. You know what I mean?
Right. Wow. Yeah. That impulse.
They hire even Americans to do it too.
Yeah, exactly. So like it's fascinating that like a lot of this stuff that we just think of, oh, the Spaniards, it's like you're giving Spain like way too much credit for like what your ancestors actually did.
Exactly. Exactly.
So,
yeah.
Now,
to be fair to an earlier point that I was talking about, though, I do think it was definitely a major mistake on the Spanish crown's part to make it virtually impossible for indigenous and blacks to be priests. Mm-hmm. I think this created a lot of problems down the line with them because
you mean blacks and Indians?
Opinion, these are populations that could have been extremely, extremely effective clergy. And I think a lot of this had to do with European clergy probably feeling.
Well, it's that in itself is interesting because you had orders who fought against each other. I think you had like the Franciscans and the Dominicans were fighting.
Right.
One side wanted indigenous priests, the other side didn't, and we can go into that a little bit later. But yeah, I mean, I think as we go through this kind of march of history, it's just coming back to the humanity, and when you come back to the humanity, you do understand that there's more than one side to every story, and it's not just two sides. There could be 64 sides, right? Like reality is extremely complex, and to kind of put this binary of good versus evil is very like Disney-esque, right? It's very immature from what humans actually are, the full complexity of a human existence, body, mind, and soul. But
well, I mean, yeah, and even like this utopianism. I want to talk a little. We'll talk a little bit about Aztec utopianism. It's like you have these people these like activists promoting the idea that somehow the Aztecs, Mesoamerica was in complete peace. It was just like these astronomers and stuff like that. Now, having said that, I don't want to simply sound like somebody like, oh, well, they deserve to have their land taken away because they used to fight wars too. Like I'm not making that argument either, but they weren't peaceful. They weren't at peace. Like Cortez stepped into the middle of like a regional war,
a cartel war.
Like, how are you going to how do we glorify the Aztec warrior? How were there Aztec warriors if there were no wars? It doesn't even make sense.
There's a very Germanic line of academic thought from people like Oswald Spengler that, like, if you read what they talked about with like Spanish history, it was always like the Spanish were barbarians, but the Moors and the Aztecs were both about to go to space before the Spanish defeated them.
The Catholic Mexicans of Spain.
The Mexican, like the coping is just it's unreal. It's unreal. Like the level of cope. It's like this is why, like, I don't want to be too cruel or too negative in my assessment, but this is why it's like in a lot of ways in Mexico, the frontier spirit is dead. It's the guy, the castizo or mestizo in Guadalajara who should be out there leading Mexico's armies and like building new towns, like he's like, sitting in Guadalajara crying and thinking he's an Aztec and he's a victim. It's just it's really sad what this propaganda has done, and it's all political. It doesn't have to be that way, but it's entirely
well, and that's important to understand how historical narratives can be used as weapons for or against you, right? Like that's kind of up to a man as an individual to kind of say, like, I'm either going to adopt the historical narrative that perhaps my rivals or competitors have given to me, or perhaps someone who has an economic interest that conflicts with mine own economic interest, or I can kind of dive in and kind of pull something out of my own. And I think this process of, us kind of digging into the history books and letting the movie play before a certain part that they never let us watch as kids, in a sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you weren't supposed to look in those 300 years of the Spanish Empire. You're only supposed to look from the dawn of the dysfunctional republic that you inherit, that your parents fled from.
Like, you talk to people, like their identity does not matter before 1821. It's like,
history starts with Napoleon, right? Like before it goes from Napoleon to the Caesars.
Yeah. It's like so much of our history of like who we are happened in the 300 years before the Wars of Independence. Like it's just, I see, Taco, you want to jump in on this and make this point. I'll say something and then you can just jump in. But in New Mexico, this is the big difference between people in Mexico and New Mexico. Mexican identity, it feels ancient, but in a lot of ways, it's a very modern invention. Like, for example, if you're from Michoacan and you think you're Aztec and you think you're part of some 500-year struggle as an Aztec, your identity was invented for you like in the 1930s through Mexico's education system. Like it's not a modern identity. It's not an ancient identity. It's a modern identity that looks ancient.
That was crafted by these kind of.
Right. It was crafted by, like Mexican intellectuals, but it wasn't handed down to you from your grandma.
Yeah.
This is why a lot of people are like, oh, all these Aztec traditions they've all been lost. And like, it's like, no, you've never had them. Like, you had other indigenous traditions.
This is what we call ethno-schizophrenia, right? This is very common amongst the Latin American, person, mixed race person, that we have this inherited ethnic schizophrenia where, again, like, wait, the whole narrative of my country that I was told to be the flag and that I was told to be proud of has told me we were the indigenous women who got boinked. We're never the virility who boinks. You know what I mean? Like, it's just, it's very weird.
This is something I've noticed on whenever Hispanic people, Americans, like whenever they go on that one show on PBS called like Discovering Your Roots or something along the lines. I forget the name.
With Henry Louis Gates.
They find out that their family members, they weren't Aztecs that were slaves for 300 years, and that maternally they usually come from some non-Aztec tribe if they're Mexican, and then paternally they come from like Spanish settlers that came quite a while after the conquest
and governor
and did well for themselves. And then I remember Danny Trejo, he went on that recently and he started crying because he had no idea about any of this in his history. God. And now he's about to play a conquistador in a movie where they're going to invade the Philippines.
Wow.
For the first time.
No way. They're making a movie about that?
They are. It's kind of like Black Legend-ish, but yeah, Danny Trejo is going to play a conquistador.
You mentioned the term, and that's what we have to, that's what we've all kind of have come to grips with. That's been kind of the main theme, I think, of the conversation these last couple of years, is like the Black Legend exists. There was actually a propaganda war that Spain utterly lost, the Spanish Empire utterly lost. And we're kind of products of this psyop, kind of proto-psyop, that is the Black Legend. And it's kind of unpacking this and really recognizing history for what it is dispassionately which is that journey you've gone through personally, kind of lets you come out of it on the other end in a different way, where now Danny Trejo is fine donning a conquistador helmet.
That's so based.
Because it shows the arc, right? It shows how we've come full circle and kind of realized something. And that's what I'd like to go into is, how have like this kind of shedding of untruths or of myths that didn't hold to scrutiny affected your sense of self or your kind of metaphysical posturing in a sense, or like kind of, you get what I'm getting at? Like, how does that affect you as an individual?
So I'll answer that question, but I know Taco wants to jump in. So let's go ahead and let him jump in.
Yeah,
and then,
sure.
And then I'll answer your question because I have a good answer for that.
Yeah. So just 2 quick points. First, one of the issues that the Cristeros were fighting was the taking over of private religious education and the forcing of the children to go to public funded schools. So when you talk about that, if you're from Michoacan and you think you're an Aztec and that you were part of this 500-year struggle against the Spaniards, that was instilled in these public schools. And that was something that the Freemasons, in like one of their like magazine reviews around that time, they were very proud of that fact that the government was going in and taking over the public education of the pueblos and of the people. And the second thing was that the myth of the noble savage, of that, these Indios were all living in peace. That's something that like happened, in literature and also like, architecture and like maybe like you could say North American life in general around like the turn of like the 20th century and like the early 1900s. And in New York City, you'll see that on Manhattan Bridge that goes from Manhattan to Brooklyn, there's like this really beautiful, architecture that's like Butte art style in some of like the buildings and around it, and also in
like
the
Art
entrance.
Nouveau or Art Deco.
Yeah, right.
But this comes from Voltaire.
Right?
The whole notion of the noble savage, which is racist as fuck and paternalistic as fuck, comes from the French Revolution.
Yeah,
that has to be understood.
They were like these like French, basic like architectural styles, and like inside, they're like these reliefs of like images of the scenes of like the frontier and the buffalo and the Indians hunting, and it's like a romanticized version of the past that already this is like 1 or 2 generations removed, who actually built these. This architecture and this art. So they're like already removed from the time when this occurred. And so they're romanticizing about a past that they're not themselves familiar with, because like they had already exterminated or moved out, ethnically cleansed all of the natives from the Northeast already at that point. So there's these people like, romanticizing about what life would have been like. And that's why like you get the idea that they're all, hanging out together, smoking peace pipe, and just chilling, when reality, like they were actually like, scalping heads. And, 2 generations or 3 generations prior, those people would have understood that. They would know that because they would live that reality.
Well,
yeah.
the French were comparing. They initially started that train of thought with kind of saying that like we're like the Gauls that Caesar wasn't able to like rape and kill, basically, and it logically spread to the Americas. I'm serious. That's how it started out.
These people are so insufferable. It's crazy. Oh man. Yeah. Well, and Taco, just to piggyback on that. This I feel like this ideology has been even more destructive in Mexico and Latin America, because ever since independence, there's been the destruction of institutions. Here's a very good example. The church had ran most of the universities in Mexico during the colonial period, because they were like the intellectual class. It was like an intellectual priestly class. So of course, a lot of the universities would be managed by the church. And so right after independence, and these are very, very, even the best universities in Mexico today still have their roots in these institutions that were created in the colonial period. Well, right after independence, Mexico basically couldn't decide what to do with them. It was okay. Do we let them continue to be run by the clergy, or do we seize these universities and have them run secularly? So this created, instead of just building more institutions and just having the traditional ones, and then also having maybe secular ones, instead of just keeping what they had intact, they just shut down the universities. So for 100 years after independence, Mexico basically had no functioning universities. Think about that. You're trying to run a country and you don't have functioning universities to create, an intellectual class to actually run the country. And so, a lot of this was just like for petty BS. You shut down the university so you can liquidate it for its furniture and stuff like that. And so for 100 years, Mexico wasn't educating a new, post-independence.
What era was this? This is basically the 1800s.
It's basically from 1824 onwards.
Till Diaz?
No, like the Republic, like the very beginning of the Republic.
No, that's what I mean. From the
know,
beginning of the Republic till basically Diaz.
Until Diaz actually started to implement new public schooling.
Uh-huh.
But the universities weren't fully like reestablished until like the 1930s or 40s.
Wow.
Yeah.
And Vasconcelos plays a big role in that. He was like the first director of education.
Yeah, and so even the Catholic Church had local schools too, which is what Taco's pointing out. But even those were seized by the government. So what the Mexican government does is like these institutions get created by the church or by somebody else, and then the government just goes in there and seizes them. And then it's just like and people they get the public to go along with destroying these institutions because they could say like, oh well, it's all colonial stuff and let's just destroy it and let's just go back to our Aztec roots or something like that. And it's very reminiscent of like Pol Pot and the idea of year zero, where it's like, let's just destroy every aspect of modernity and maybe we'll get back to some glorious Angkor Wat period or something like that. And that's basically been the story. It's basically been the story of Mexico ever since independence. And it's like, you should have just taken what was there, reformed it, made changes, improved it. It's like the whole issue with indigenous land. It's like they wanted to destroy indigenous culture in post-independence Mexico, and part of doing that was destroying the community, because if you take away the land, there's no place for people to congregate to.
And this is when they impose like language standardization. And again, all this comes from France. Like this is not Mexico doing Spain. This is Mexico doing France. And this happened in Argentina as well. This happened basically everywhere. And again, it's like, the idea is that you're going to put blinders to your sense of self, assuming that you only exist from the Napoleonic era forwards, when the reality is there's a whole, the republics have existed, let's just say more or less for 200 years, right? The republicans, right? But there's a whole 300 years before that you're not drawing any context or understanding or sense of self from. And because of that, then you're cut off from 1,500 years prior to that on both sides of the pond, if you will.
Yeah, a lot of these ideas do originate from like France through the French Revolution, but a lot of it's filtered through the United States first, and then it gets like exported to Mexico. And in the modern times, basically just exported by, U.S. funded nonprofit organizations and stuff like that.
Like the NGOs today that push basically identity politics, LGBT, feminism, all the ism schisms that are used in a sense as kind of fifth columns or color revolutionists within Latin America are all paid for by your tax dollars, American taxpayer.
Yeah, so
we talked about this a bunch of times on our show, Critical Theory, the Frankfurt School, the Yale, Columbia, CIA, Mafia, all that, how it all ties into each other, basically destruction of the existing social structures to create something different. And that's very reminiscent of what you were saying. And it makes you it hits home your point, Tokyo, that you were saying that the early government was very communistic without, actually using the word.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to go back on the point in which you were mentioning the education system in Mexico and the brainwashing or implementation of like the victim complex of the Aztec myth.
Mm-hmm.
I think it really puts into perspective one of the things that's not really paid attention to is a lot of us are really products of a lot of Spanish immigrants that came post-independence. And you had this in a lot of Latin American countries. In Argentina, you had something similar as well, where it was mainly immigrants from Italy. So you find that even in places like Mexico, South America, Central America, where you had this new arrival of new, Spanish immigrants, you still had that mixture, that mestizaje going on. The only difference was that in comparison to, and contrast to the colonial times, there was a different narrative that was being pushed. Like mestizos, during colonial times, didn't believe they were Aztecs. They strived for the most part to assimilate or to be part of the dominant Hispanic Spanish culture. And you had even prominent mestizo writers like in Peru, the Viceroyalty of Peru, which is, I believe his name was Inca Dioscalo de la Vega, who actually wrote proudly of both of his roots. There wasn't really a victim complex. He actually made a really good book on what was going on in Florida as well, the conquest of Florida. But then you go post-independence, where even though that same exact mestizaje is going on, now it's being, twisted into a victim complex. So you see that, even though mestizaje post-colonial times, right, during the Republican era,
so in colonial times, identity was very much driven by different factors, right? So there were, people's identities have multiple parts to them, right? So, in one aspect, if you lived in Nueva Galicia, you might trace your paternal lineage back to, the Spanish men who founded the city you lived in, because a lot of people, they didn't move around so much as you would think, unless they were like moving northward to establish a new town. Like usually, like my family stayed in the same exact place, literally since they came from Spain. And so you might, and then even in a place like Jalisco, even like the local towns that were built there that are indigenous towns, a lot of them, they were like built by Tlaxcaltecas because there were usually before areas were cleared for settlement, there were massive wars in some places, not every place, but especially as you moved up northward. So your identity was centered on your kingdom, if it was Nueva Galicia or El Reino de Mexico or El Nuevo Reino de León. Like if your identity was centered on your kingdom, it was centered on your town. And then maybe like from a religious aspect, your town's patron saint, and then your loyalty to the king. And so there were all many other factors that played into this. And so it wasn't tied to, I'm in this struggle for liberation or something like that. It was I would describe it more as a pioneering identity. And whereas post-independence, for the first, a very long period, decades after independence, some of this stuff didn't change, right? Mexico was still very Catholic. People still celebrated their patron saints. They were still proud of their towns. A lot of this stuff, because, Mexico didn't have a public schooling system. So identity wasn't upended yet. It didn't upend really for indigenous people first until they started breaking up indigenous lands. And so whatever identity you had that was tied to this ancestral town, it was gone, right? Because like the land was like seized, your family was kicked out, and then you went to go live on a hacienda. you no longer identified as indigenous. You spoke Spanish, but you also didn't go to public schooling because there was no school. So you were just like a campesino farm worker speaking Spanish. And then so it wasn't until, as we get to like the turn of the century, the early 1900s, especially like the 1930s, 40s, 50s, that's when you start seeing Mexico able to really, really push the national narrative in a way that it couldn't before. And so part of that narrative, that's part of, and the Aztec, the We Was Aztec narrative, that had existed in Mexico from the very beginning of independence. Like, there were like, that was already like an intellectual school of thought. Like, we was Aztecs, and this war is a war of liberation, and we are reclaiming our sovereignty. Like that, criollos had created that like before Mexico became independent, and they basically made that the ideology of the country. And it didn't really reach the masses until, the 20th century. And part of that is the victimhood narrative, the We Was Aztecs, tearing people away from Catholicism, etc.
Right. That was the ultimate effect, I guess.
Yeah.
So to kind of bring it back, I know we got to sign off pretty soon here. But again, I'd like to close on this. Like, man, this is like, it's like a roller coaster ride, right? It's like a historical, psychological, emotional roller coaster ride, uncovering this history, really getting a fuller grasp of reality, right? Because a lot of false precepts of what the world was like when you first started this journey, as opposed to what you realize it's actually like now, has to be, I mean, for me personally, it's like running up and down a hill. it's like a roller coaster. But what would you say are, what are some of those changes? How does uncovering this, realizing this, stepping back from it now, change you as a person for the better? And as it's true as an individual, what do you think makes a difference as a collective of not just, Mexican Americans, but Latin Americans as a whole going through the same process?
I would say, first of all, I'm very happy that I have, explored all of these ideas in time to teach my kids correctly about my family history, because they're not going to be sucked into this other stuff. They're going to be able to neutralize that kind of stuff.
They're not going to go through the Mecha circuit.
No, not at all.
And this is what Tercio, to give him some credit, he kind of coined this the Hispano pill. Like, you took the Hispano pill, and now you're now you're off the Anglo matrix. Yeah,
exactly. So, one is that if you ever, I know some folks on this call are probably still young and don't have kids, but if you don't have kids yet, get this stuff in line. Get clarity about your family history before you have kids, or at least while they're still young, so that way you could teach them correctly, so they don't get sucked into any kind of political radicalism. And then also, I think part of this journey is also becoming less nationalistic. I think, and there's nothing wrong with that. You do not have to tie your identity to a narrative that was created for you by some, intellectuals in Mexico City. Like, you have a story, your family has its own story. And that doesn't mean don't be proud of being Mexican. Like, I'm proud of being Mexican. If you ask my kids what they are, they won't say, oh, we're Spaniards. If my kids were, like, I've never once have I told my kids that we're Spaniards or something
or
like
from
that.
El Reino de Valladolid.
Yeah, exactly. No, like, I mean, if you ask them what they are, they'll say they're Mexican or Mexican American. That's it. I'm not creating a false consciousness in them, but also you don't have to be, tying yourself to a political ideology. Political ideologies change. If you're old enough, you'll see political beliefs and trends change with the decades. And so, you could de-radicalize yourself if you found yourself in some sort of. I know this is going on YouTube, so if you're out there and you found yourself in some sort of like political radicalization, like de-radicalize yourself from that stuff. Focus on the history of your family, learn a little bit about yourself. You're Mexican or, from some other Latin American country, no matter what, you don't have to like think you're Aztec to, or like think you're part of some like, War of the Reform struggle to like prove how Mexican you are or something like that. Like you're Mexican no matter what. And you'll find that your family history tells a much different story, as I have found. And, one last thing I would say, if your family's been in your town for like several generations, you should look up the founders of your town. There's a high chance that your last name is on that list because those were your ancestors that built the town, or somebody else from your family tree is on that list. Anyways, yeah, once you go down that journey, focus on the history of your family, and then everything else will make much more sense.
I was going to say, there's two kind of main points I want to make, and one's kind of like reading a quote by Che Guevara that I think we're all kind of familiar with. It says, "The division of America into unstable and illusionary nations is completely fictional. We constitute a single mestizo race, which from Mexico to the Magellan Straits bears notable ethnographical similarities. And so, in an attempt to rid myself of the weight of small-minded provincialism, I propose a toast to Peru and to United Latin America." But I want to just touch on that and say, I think that in the United States, as it becomes more and more Hispanic in terms of people from all over Hispanoamerica and people living in the same barrios, marrying people from other Hispanic countries, it's going to become more and more self-evident, especially as we become more economically ascendant, and our families are mixed with other Hispanic groups in Latin America, that we are Hispanic, and this is what binds us together. And this language and culture that we have is not something that just fell out of the sky or was invented by Richard Nixon in the 1970s. It's something that, you see it. It has the weight. In Chicago, it has the weight of history, where you see lots of people that are half Mexican, half Puerto Rican. Those people, it's a lot more easier to convince them that, yeah, obviously you're Hispanic. Your families aren't that different at the end of the day. They were both a part of Nueva España. They are different. There are differences there, but these are differences that Che Guevara noted of provincialism and locality, not of being distinctly different people who you cannot relate to on a ethnic level. If that makes sense.
These are regional differences. Like saying somebody's from Tennessee and someone's from New Hampshire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been to Chile. I went to Santiago, Chile. I went to another place, Copiapó. I mean, I didn't feel like I stood out there. Like I was just
like you went to a foreign land. It's like you went to your aunt's house. That's how I've described it to you.
Yeah, it was just like being at home. And then,
how foreign did you feel in Spain when you lived there?
Yeah, I want to touch on that.
Oh, yeah. So. I did not. I don't know if I was there long enough to see like subtleties that maybe people who have spent more time there could see, but I didn't feel out of place at all. Like I just felt like I went to four major cities. I went to Barcelona, Madrid, Sevilla, and Granada. And the only place that I genuinely felt out of place, that I was just in some random European country that I didn't have any local ties to, it was in Barcelona. And that's because they speak Catalan. All the advertisements and stuff are in Catalan. And the people just have a different kind of like, I don't know, there's a different vibe there. It's not like a bad place, but it's just a different vibe. But it's, when I was in like Sevilla, for example, I went to church, I went to mass and stuff like that. And, I felt like I could live there. Like I didn't feel any negativity towards me. Some cab drivers asked me why I speak Spanish, and I would say, oh, part of my family's from Mexico or something like, and nobody like there was no horrific treatment that people promised me would happen. It was just a normal, peaceful experience. And when I was in Madrid, I really liked. My favorite was Sevilla, but I also really liked Madrid because it felt like it felt like a Spanish speaking, clean New York. Yeah, very clean.
What they took from us.
But it's like everybody there is Latin American. A lot of people are Latin American there. Like a lot of the immigrants, obviously there's Spanish people there, but like,
yeah, there's a lot of Colombians and
a lot of them. Yeah. Like
in Madrid.
Yeah. And like when you go, like I saw like, even like regular, like middle-class jobs, like, like it's all Latin Americans, like, so when you go there, like, it's like, you don't feel out of place. You don't feel out of place any more than like, being Mexican and walking down the street in like Los Angeles or Chicago. Like you're just part, you're like part of, you just look like you blend in with the people. And, and that's not just because like, I don't know, my skin tone or something like that, but, like I just didn't feel like even people that were like darker than me, like, it's almost like, oh, it's Madrid and this person's Latin American. Of course they look like they blend in with everybody else. They're like, It's just such it's like an international city for Spanish speaking people.
Kind of like Miami.
And, yeah. There's a lot of Dominicans there too.
Yeah. Absolutely.
That's kind of the vibe in Miami. But the way I've always described it, because I've been fortunate enough, and I realize that obviously is part of my experience, and it's going to plague everything that I share on the internet with people, is that I've been able to travel extensively throughout Mexico and Latin America and have friends from all over the place south of the border. And for me, it just feels like I'm going to an aunt's house. Like when I go to my aunt's house, like my aunt's not going to look at me weird if I open up her fridge without asking and like pull some money. It's like it's a familial tone. It's like it's not my house. I'm not going to dispose of it like it's my mom's house. Of course not. But it's my aunt's house who loves me just the same way, right? Maybe she spoils me the same way. So that's how it feels every time I'm in a different part of Latin America and Spain.
Yeah, we visited Peru together, Noel, and yeah, like the downtown capital where they have all of like the congressional buildings and everything.
The cathedral, the cobblestone streets, it's all the same shit.
It's the same shit. Like you go to the same area in like Bogota and it's like if you blindfolded me, I wouldn't fucking know the difference.
It's a little hard to tell.
Yeah. So like when I was in Spain, like there was nothing. I thought that Spanish people were very well-mannered people. I don't know I know like people in like Chicanos or people in Mexico might have like these like, I don't know if they think Spanish people like they think they're like superhumans or something. It might go back to this idea that 500 Spanish guys just like completely obliterated the Aztecs. It might go.
That's what they learned in school.
Yeah, I didn't see Spanish people. To me, like they look like Starbucks employees. Like they don't look like the big rugged vaquero. Like that's like a Southwestern thing. Like the rugged vaquero criollo look.
Right.
I didn't see like honestly. Here's another impression that I got from Spain, and this is definitely something that added to my perspective that I didn't know before. So Spain has a lot of local regional cultures, and it's not. I think we tend to think of Spain as like a monolith when in reality, and I'm not just talking about like oh, there's the Basque people and the Catalan people. I'm not just talking about that. Like even like among the Castellano kind of people themselves, there's like very, very localized.
There's regional differences.
Yeah, and I could tell you like when you go to Sevilla and that kind of like southern Spain, it's almost like think about like the easiest way to like describe it. It's like imagine if Texas conquered China and brought Texas culture to China and like acculturated the people into Texas culture. And then people in China thinking all of the United States is like Texas. That's kind of like what happened to Latin America. It's like,
I've been to Sevilla.
Because you're talking about Extremadura and Andalusia.
Right. Yep. Right. And so it's like, we are the descendants of a very particular cultural stream in Spain. We are like, there's 3 provinces. If you guys are curious about this, you should look at these 3 provinces. There's Cádiz, Sevilla, and Huelva. And there's a river that cuts through it. It's called the Guadalquivir River. And our Hispanic culture emerges from there. That's where you see like the vaquero or like the gaucho kind of culture, the ranching culture. And the overwhelming majority of people from that went to the Americas from Spain were from southern Spain. But the very like heart of who we are, or at least our Hispanic side is,
it's this river valley.
This area around the Guadalquivir River. And like when you go to Spain, you actually, or if you look up that stuff from Spain, you'll see like, okay, this is where we have similarities. And so you may not see some of those. This is why when people say they're going to go to Spain, I always say, make sure you go to southern Spain, because that's where you're going to see where your roots come from.
My roots are
13, Spain 13, Holmes.
Hell yeah.
I was going to say, I have a lot of Basque roots as well, and I want to visit that part if I ever visit Spain again. But on that topic as well, I want people listening to understand that if your ancestors from Spain came to Latin America in like the 18 and 1900s, there's a very good chance that some of them at least did not speak Spanish as a first language in their house. That a lot of them spoke these distinct languages like Catalonian, Basque, etc., and only started to use these languages in their everyday life with other people once they moved to Latin America.
And so I guess it's my turn to jump in. I just want to say thank you for joining us, Tokyo Drifter. I going back to that, that TikTok you made talking about your grandfather and your grandma. It really hit me, man, because we share from the same area, we come from the same area, and that's basically how I got to start forming my own identity in terms of I'm Hispano, Mexicano from Michoacan, and basically growing up being in New York, I was growing up kind of in an Ellis Islander mode where we have to assimilate, and it's the melting pot, and because literally I'm 26 miles from the island, so
wow,
that way of upbringing was taught to my mother, who got here from the Italians that were here before her and who made friends with her, and to passed down to me. So even though being Mexican was a big part of our culture, it was huge, always in my house. We would always put on performances and events for the city and the library and the cultural centers. So we were very much still Mexican, but it was under the context that we're Mexican, but we have to assimilate here. Whereas looking back at my roots, and reconciling where my people came from and who my actual ancestors are, to this American story, this American myth, I realized I don't fit in here, I wasn't part of the Boston Tea Party,
right?
I mean, I wasn't part of this story. My people came much later, but here we have
actually your people came much earlier.
I mean, but
as Joe Biden said, yes,
y'all was here before us.
Yeah, but to the Northeast and everything, and that whole season.
But I can see how what Rancho was saying. I can see how that's not readily apparent if you live in the Northeast, right? But if you live in the Southwest, you could feel.
Because it's Sepulveda Boulevard and Pico Avenue and Santa Monica and San Bernardino,
right. But Taco, yeah, exactly. And I see what you're saying. It's you could detach yourself from these national narratives because it's you have your own story,
Right. And so I kind of realized that my people have their own history, their own story. My last name is among the town's founders in Cotija. It goes back, like you said, to the late 1500s, early 1600s. There's 400 years of history of my people there, of the ranching culture. I recently went there and spent a month for the first time in my life. I'm 36 now. And for the very first time I went there and I got to meet my ancestors, my grandmother's brothers, the old folks that are still alive in their 90s. You know what I mean? Yeah. And we're basically from Jalisco and Michoacan, and that whole ranching culture where they're butchers and ironsmiths, blacksmiths, right, for horseshoes and that was their business and that was their trade, is all revolving around the rancherios there in the area. So, it was a really good, experience, like watching that video, because I was like, yeah, man, I can relate to him. And then, like, you said something at the end of it, was like, don't hate like any part of who you are, right? Like, you got to accept who you are and you got to love who you are. And I think that's a beautiful thing, because like everybody has individual circumstances of like their birth and like, the history of their genealogy. But like, at the end of the day, God wanted us alive for a reason, no matter the circumstances of our birth. And like, so there's a reason why we're here on this earth, to experience life. And, you have to be grateful for like all the people that came before you that made that existence possible, because God wanted them to exist too, so, we're just part of that divine providence. So, I just wanted to say thank you, man, for putting that stuff out there.
Thank you so much for the kind words.
And I wanted to budge in here. I agree with, want to relate a little bit to what Taco was saying, and also a video that you had posted, Tokyo, where you had you were explaining why you didn't feel an attachment to the Aztec myth, and you went over your family history and how you came from a family of cattle ranchers. I think that it's also very important for us to be able to guard our heritage and recognize our heritage. First off, by recognizing our heritage, because there are a lot of people from the outside who didn't form a part of being at the frontier, right? They didn't form a part of settling and establishing cities and such. So a lot of times we get criticism or certain narratives pushed on us from people who are exactly that. They're Ellis Islanders, like Italian Ellis Islanders. And
you're pointing at like there's a difference between kind of people who were founders and settlers, and then people who came here after being founded and settled. Exactly.
And I mean, one of the things we had mentioned too was how even certain people that came from certain regions of Spain brought those cultures to Latin America, and how that shaped our own cultures today. You had a very similar thing happen as well with the United States, right? You have the Southerners, who I believe most of them came from Southwest Spain.
England.
Southwest England, my bad. Southwest England, and they're what we call now the Dixie population. A lot of them are Scots-Irish, and they carry a very distinct culture from the Yankees up north. Right. So it was very similar with our situation as well. But, like I said, I appreciate all the work that you do. You've been a light to, I sometimes have a bit of free time and spend it on TikTok. So I also see a lot of videos of people that push liberal propaganda. But finding your channel and seeing your videos has given me a lot of hope and pushing out kind of the word for us to protect our legacy, our Hispanic legacy here. Because frankly, it's been under a lot of attack.
From multiple sides, for sure.
From multiple sides, absolutely. From multiple sides. And you even have it from even people from within inside of our community, you could say,
Yes, absolutely. They kind of become proxy to outside forces that see in us a threat, whether it's economic or political or demographic. And I think we're all adults, and we should be able to talk about this openly without kind of being scared of it being offensive or awkward. I mean, this is how humanity operates. And I think, again, it's important to really understand that historical narratives can be used as weapons for or against you. And in your history as a human being, it's up to you to use it and utilize it for however it can benefit you. And how, Drifter pointed out that he's glad that he kind of went through this process as he was, dawning a new generation, because his son, and I'm in the same situation with my son, they're not going to waste time or kind of go through this kind of maze of this kind of, post-Napoleonic sense of history that at the end of the day is kind of spiritually castrating. Right? It kind of victimizes you. It puts you into this cubbyhole of a victim class, as opposed to just taking a more honest approach to history. And because you're related to this long narrative of history, now you're free to draw examples from people who are connected to you and related to you for inspiration. Whereas before, you're very limited in what you can draw from. And that affects your posture, metaphysically speaking. That affects the way you, portray yourself or present yourself to society. Society, in a very unspoken way, can kind of pick up on these inferiority complexes or insecurities. And if there is a perceived competitiveness from you, they will use that against you. But again, if you take possession of it, then they can't. And that, I think, is crucial to this whole concept that we've said of the Hispanopeo, or the Momento Hispano as a whole, where you have these American-born Hispanics or American-raised Hispanics kind of having the freedom to step behind the curtain a little bit, 300 years prior to it, right? And take a fuller picture of themselves than maybe some of our relatives south of the border are.
Absolutely. I think we're in a very special moment because we're very much separated from, the Latin American republics as governments. So we're in a stage where we can build ourselves a new identity, And
it's not, and here the crucial thing is that it's not artificial, right? There is no wee-wuzzing, there is no LARPing. Like, literally, dog, go to the church that your grandfather was baptized in and follow the paperwork, and you're going to end up in 1492. And then prior to that, right? It's up to you to kind of do that. There is no LARPing here. There is no cultural appropriation here. This is our history. We are the products of this very human historical development, this great epoch of history. And we should take possession of that.
Just to add some clarity on that, my third great grandfather is buried in the church where in my family's hometown, which is pretty basic. There is something we could look to in the United States and see, kind of reminisce on our own experiences. So as somebody whose grandmother was descended from the founders in Los Angeles, and somebody whose grandfather is from Michoacan, I could see the parallels in both, where we have these cities that were created in the Southwest and in Florida that are Hispanic. They were founded by Hispanic settlers. So even if your family doesn't descend from those particular people, learn about those cities that were established in the Southwest and in Florida. Learn about the expeditions. Learn about all those things that happened. And the stories are very similar to where we're from in Latin America. So there's a lot of parallels between my grandpa's family, my grandmother's family. And so at least if for folks that have trouble reading Spanish, there's a lot of good work that's been done on stuff that happened in New Mexico with the founding of Santa Fe and stuff like that. There's a lot of good work that's been done in English on the founding of Los Angeles and San Jose and those other cities. So learn about those pioneers, and you'll learn a lot about yourself. Even if your family's not originally from the Southwest, you'll still learn about what your family went through when your forefathers came. And and then also take part if you live near any of that. Like Taco, you said you're from San Diego. They do reenactments they have Spanish days where they do reenactments where they talk about the founding of San Diego and stuff like that. I don't know if you have kids, but if you ever do, take them to this stuff and say hey, some of our, culturally, some of our forefathers established these cities. And then, it might help your own children understand how Cotijo was founded and stuff like that.
Yeah. So, thank you. Yeah. I'm in San Diego now. I moved here. I did take my stepson to see the mission that was founded by Juniper Poseta. And I did talk with him a lot about like, hey, like this is part of our heritage, and and they've been to the kids, like my nieces and my stepson, like they've been to Cotija even before I have, and like they feel at home there. It's my my fiance and her sister, and then they grew up in Cotija, so they did a really good job of making sure that was always part of their culture. Also because they're from the San Diego area, and they're like literally 15 minutes from Mexico, so like the ties there are strong. Whereas like I was kind of like out like in the hinterlands, in Gringolandia. So
Right.
Yep. I will though. Thank you. If you can like let me know, or I can look up when those days are. I'd be interested in going to check some of that stuff out.
Excellent.
Yeah, well, with that, I think we gotta go on about our days here. But Tokyo, seriously, brother, it's an honor to have you on the show. Thank you so much for all the work you do. For the audience, check out his channel, Tokyo Drifter, on TikTok and YouTube. So many nuggets of Hispanic history, Mexican history, Michoacano history, California history. But like we've said over and over again, all this history is paralleled no matter what corner of Latin America you're from. It's all our history. And yeah, I highly recommend it. In Tokyo, hopefully, bro, you can come back and maybe we can go off on some of these tangents and go real deep. I'm sure the audience is really going to appreciate that.
Excellent. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. And let's keep this conversation going.
Amen. All right. Cheers, gentlemen. God bless.